In 1968, my family moved from the city to a new house on a rural dirt road in Heinsberg, Vermont. I was 9. There were no kids within a few miles except my older brother Woody, whom I fought with more often than not. Our TV only got 3 channels. One was in Quebecois French, and my mother regularly insisted that we go outside and play, or fight, as the case may be, until dinner. So on weekends, we hung out at the Morse's house, helping out with whatever project and chore came up. Jim and Margaret Morse were a late 20-something couple from suburban New Jersey who decided to live out their Green Acres fantasy by buying the old house and acreage across the road from ours and turning it into a small hobby farm. Over a period of years, Jim and Margaret got chickens, a few calves, pigs, and Lumley, the goose, who is much more of a vicious watchdog than any of the sickly and short-lived dogs that Margaret would serially adopt from the shelter. Margaret loved to bake, and sometimes she'd put me to work in the kitchen. I learned the fundamentals of baking bread and the art of canning fruit and jam and vegetables at a young age. She taught me weights and measures before we covered them in 6th grade. A pint's a pound the world around. 2 tablespoons an ounce will make 8 ounces a cup, whether you drink or bake. She was also a high school science teacher, so she explained yeast and why sterilizing canning jars was necessary and how pressure cookers worked. Margaret's husband, Jim, was an environmental biologist who worked for the state, but at home he fashioned himself as a master builder. Woody and I picked up basic figure-it-out-as-you-go carpentry, foregoing any concept of craft with Jim and his equally unskilled friends. We helped build a chicken coop, a large storage shed, fences, a pigsty. I learned about joists, studs, rafters, and that level is always better than square, and that there's an amazing versatility of both the Homelight chainsaw and the word fuck. When not building something, we were put to work in the garden that produced zucchinis the size of ottomans. For some reason, Woody and I just got along when we were helping out at the Morses, but not all aspects of idyllic farm life were pleasant. The first indication of this was the 2 calves taken away, returning later as a couple dozen packages of veal in the huge freezer in the Morse's mudroom. The 3rd calf avoided the fate of the other 2. We named him Roger. He was friendly and would come over to the fence when you called him for a scratch behind the ear. One weekend, the Brown brothers from the dairy farm down the road came over. Gary and Craig Brown were much bigger than the average high school kid, and Jim recruited them when he needed volunteer muscle with the lure of underage drinking. Craig held the calf down while Gary instructed Jim on how to cut Roger's testicles out, pinch and staple the incision closed, and apply the chocolate-covered healing salve. I was at Roger's head, not doing much holding, but assigned the task of keeping him calm. Roger's panic eye stared straight into mine as if to say, hey, I thought we were friends. But after this episode, Roger wasn't that friendly. A month later, the Morses got another young calf, Ralph, who also went through the ritual castration to enter his steerdom, and Ralph and Roger grew to the ripe old age of 2 before becoming steaks, roast, and burger packets in the mudroom freezer. In the fall, once the 40 chicks had grown and those identifying as hens began laying eggs, it was time to thin the flock by harvesting the young and sadly useless males. It became obvious to me at a young age that if you reincarnate as a farm animal, it's better to be female. Woody and I took turns climbing into the chicken coop to grab the next contestant and bring it over to Jim, where he somehow determined its sex. Hens were splotched with a magic marker and returned to the coop for a life of egg-laying servitude. But once the unlucky male was outed, our job was to hold him down on the chopping block as Jim pulled its head before lopping it off with the quick swat of an axe. By the 3rd chicken, Woody discovered that if you immediately let go of the headless chicken, it will run away. blood pulsating out of its neck and everything. After picking up some decent yardage, the scrambling chicken will slow to a wobble before collapsing, sometimes still flapping a wing or moving his feet or something for another few seconds. Margaret had an entire explanation for how a chicken's nervous system can do this without a brain, but we didn't care. Woody and I just turned this whole headless chicken thing into a competition to see whose chicken could run the furthest, and Woody won. He had a brown one that made it 40 feet. Might have gone farther if it hadn't slammed into the garden fence. Dead chickens were brought back to Margaret, where she attached a bent-up wire hanger to the feet, dropped it into a cauldron of boiling water, and after a minute, she hung him up from the hook, and then we began yanking off the steaming feathers. Once plucked naked, Margaret put the bird on a makeshift table, sliced a 4-inch hole between the legs, and through which you could insert your hand and pull out most of its still warm guts in a single yank. Margaret turned gutting into a biology lesson as well. We were shown the heart, the liver, the craw, and gizzard of each chicken. I'm still not sure what a gizzard does. Together, we hacked and packed over 24 chickens that day to join the veal in the freezer. Headless chickens and eventually headless people began making regular appearances in my preteen nightmares for a while. I was a little more tormented by recurring thoughts of decapitation than you would expect in an otherwise normal 10-year-old. When Jim brought home the 3 piglets, they were the size of footballs. We fed them with a giant baby bottle for the first few weeks, and they grew fast. We named them Larry, Moe, and Curly, even though Curly was female. The sty we built was neither square nor level. It was 20 by 20 feet, made with 2x6s and sheep wire, with one corner covered with corrugated roofing to make a suitable sleeping area. The Stooges always perked up when anyone approached, mostly because they assumed they were going to eat. Pigs, as you would expect, are all about food. Their sty soon became an aromatic melange of shit, mud, hay, and whatever they inadvertently flung out of the trough. When school started, Jim hired me to feed the Stooges on weekday mornings for $3 a week, since he and Margaret both left early for work. The pigs' breakfast was a large bucket of brown slop mixed from what appeared to be freeze-dried vomit and water with the consistency of runny oatmeal. It didn't matter. The pigs, the Stooges, they loved it. And they were thrilled to see me every morning at 6 a.m., grunting enthusiastically and taking celebratory laps around the sty in parade formation. When the Stooges were about a year and a half old, every Thursday, Margaret started taking the truck to this grocery warehouse in Williston and picking up a load of discarded snack food. Little individually wrapped cakes and cookies and pastries well beyond the sell-by date. After she backed the truck up to the sty, Woody and I sat in the back unwrapping the goodies and tossing them in or near the trough, occasionally pausing to snack on one or two ourselves. Mo got so he could hang his front feet over the top sty wall and catch snacks in his mouth if your aim was good enough, and he was clearly the athletic one. Whenever I walked up to the trough with slop in the morning, they got excited. But when Margaret backed the truck up on Old Pastry Day, they went apeshit, running around squealing in sheer joy. And if Jim ever backed the truck up on another day to drop off hay or feed in the nearby storage shed, they'd start their snack party ritual, but after a few minutes realized, it's a false alarm, and calm down. Then they'd root around in the muck and for leftovers since, they were up anyway. This regular Thursday evening pastry orgy went through the spring and summer until the end of October. The day had arrived to slaughter the Stooges. 1 for the freezer and 2 to cover slaughter and packing cost. I guess I always knew they would end up being turned into bacon hams and pork chops one day, but now it was a somber reality. So that Saturday's chore started with putting the wooden sideboards on the old truck and figuring out how to force Larry, Moe, and Curly, each over 200 pounds, up the ramp and into the back. This again required the beer-enticed volunteer muscle of the Brown brothers. Woody and I would be relegated to watching and various non-contact support roles. Once the sideboards were on the truck, Jim backed it through the pasture gate towards the sty. Woody walked alongside with Craig and Gary. I stood on the rear bumper yelling what I considered necessary backup instructions to Jim. I waited for the Stooges' Pastry Day celebration to commence, but there was none. As we got closer, I could see the Stooges still huddled in the corner of the sty, silently staring at me. I don't know if it was the sideboards on the truck, or the fact that it was Saturday morning and not Thursday evening, or the strange voices and ominous presence of the Brown brothers in rubberized bib overalls and gloves, but I could tell the pigs absolutely knew that some bad shit was going down. Each one screeched and struggled as they were gang wrestled out of the sty, got their front and rear feet tied together and shoved up the makeshift ramp into the truck. Their faces that day, the pain squealing and the sad whines they made as Jim drove away haunted me for weeks. In the morning, instead of getting dressed and running over to feed the Stooges, I would lie in bed thinking about them, about my betrayal. I felt guilty and complicit. After school, walking home from the bus stop, I tried to ignore their empty sty when I went by. This became easier in a few weeks when the sty disappeared under December snow and would stay that way until April. Margaret gave my mom one of the hams for Christmas dinner that year. As Dad started carving that big steaming hunk of pig thigh, all I could do was wonder which of the Stooges it was. I managed to take a small bite, but then I put the rest of my slab back on the platter. No one said anything when I did. Eating meat is easier when you don't know the animal's name and his favorite snack food. I've never really liked ham since. Over the next few years, the Morses' enthusiasm for raising and slaughtering animals waned. Too much work. Their chickens produced enough eggs to sell to the neighbors for 50 cents a dozen, and they got a few sheep to keep the pasture trimmed, and they sheared the wool, but they never got pigs again. By 7th grade, I started riding my bike a few miles down the road to my friend's house on weekends. Woody was in high school, and instead of fighting, we just ignored each other for a few years until later when we both discovered a mutual affinity for getting high. I have had an on and off relationship with red meat my entire life. I gave it up in my 20s. It crept back into my diet in my mid-40s before I gave it up again about 8 years ago. I don't have a problem with chicken since they're essentially fish with feathers, but I've never encountered another mammal that didn't have some sort of personality. Meat is okay when it appears prepared on a restaurant plate or when you select it neatly packaged, mostly unidentifiable small portions in a supermarket, but I always found it difficult not to think about where it comes from, especially bacon. Thank you.